Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And can I say just how nice it is to be in a room of business people? I was in Westminster earlier today, and I have to say the atmosphere here is much, much better and much happier. And it's my enviable pleasure over the next 30 minutes to try and convince you all that we should care about workplace happiness. When we talk about happiness, it's easy to sort of think it's nebulous and it's a bit happy-clappy. What I hope I can do is persuade you that actually it's important and it's measurable and it can improve the life of individuals, it can improve company performance, and it's good for society too. So my own personal journey with happiness started as a child. My dad had his own small business. He worked on his own. He was a wholesaler. He bought biscuits and sweets from the big companies. They used to deliver in lorries in the morning. I used to get up early before school and help him unload the vans, load his van, and then he would distribute to small shops and schools who couldn't afford to buy in bulk from those big distributors. Of an evening, I remember coming home from school, I'd help him unload the van. Of an evening, when the phone rang, I used to pick up the phone and I'd take orders for him, as would my brother and sister. If things were good, then we used to be taken to Llandudno to have an ice cream. If things were bad, my mum used to chase us around the house with a slipper, telling us to turn the lights off. So from a very early stage, I understood what good business and results looked like and what less good looked like. But the thing that was really helpful for me was that my dad used to preach on a Sunday. And when I used to travel with him, he used to talk a lot about how we should behave, etc. And I remember he used to continually say to me, Mark, in the eyes of God, we're all equal. Nobody's better than anybody else. We all have our own unique skills and abilities, and you should treat everybody with equal respect. And he would say to me, if somebody says something that you disagree with, don't leap in and say you disagree and put your point of view. Because everybody, from their education, their culture, their schooling, their experiences, is going to have a different view of the world. Everybody has a different view of the world. And what you should do is to try and understand better why that individual has come to that point of view. And then when you understand that, you can do one of two things. You can either change your own view of the world based on the new information that you have, or you can better explain to somebody why you formed a different point of view. So that trying to understand people's perspective and treating everybody with equal respect became really important attributes for me to have learned when I joined the John Lewis Partnership, which I did when I graduated with a degree in archaeology and ancient history, very useful for a degree in retailing, in the early 1980s. So the unique thing about the John Lewis Partnership, as many of you in this room will know, is that it's owned by all the people that work in the company. And this slide is, looks very uncomfortable, doesn't it? This is a prompt about the chap that set up the John Lewis Partnership, a man called Speed & Lewis. And in 1918, at the end of the First World War, just over 100 years ago, he was riding in Hyde Park, he had an accident, and he fell off his horse. And he was so badly injured, he had 6 months convalescing at home. And during that time, two things struck him. One, that his brother who worked in the business with him and his father earned more money than all the workers put together in John Lewis and Peter Jones, the two big department stores in London that they owned. And secondly, he went to visit people who worked in the company and who were off sick. And he was pretty appalled by the conditions that they were living in. It's also true to say, as you all know, that in 1917 there was a revolution in Russia. And there was much talk that Marxism and communism would come to the UK and that family businesses like his would be taken away from them. They might be state-owned or they might be given to the workers. So whether you feel that he was a great philanthropist or whether you feel he was working towards self-preservation, he decided that what he was going to do was to put the shares of the family business, John Lewis, into a trust for the benefit of all of the employees. Now, although he started to have that thought in 1918. It was actually in 1928, 10 years later, that he was able to do that. And the reason it took him so long was that his father, John Lewis, who set up the department store on Oxford Street, was vehemently opposed. He didn't think it was the right thing to do at all. And he would only let Speedon play with his ideas after he'd done a full day's work at John Lewis in Oxford Street. And so after the death of his father, John Lewis went through with his plan and decided to put the shares into a trust for the benefit of all the employees. Now, in many ways, you might think that's the most extraordinary thing. Imagine having a business worth hundreds of millions of pounds and you decide one day you're going to give it to the workers. He did take some money back for giving it to the workers. But the most extraordinary thing about Speedon Lewis was this. He wrote a constitution. Very few countries have a constitution, let alone businesses have a constitution. And what he set out at the start of a written constitution in 1928 was that the supreme purpose of the John Lewis Partnership should be the happiness of the people that work there. So imagine working in an organisation where the organisation's purpose is just the happiness of the people that work in the organisation. Now, there are only 3 places that I know of in the world where happiness is an objective. The American Constitution talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The King of Bhutan, for those of you who've been to Bhutan, wish happiness on his subjects. And Qatar, very recently, has switched from measuring GDP of the country to measuring the happiness of the nation. But in reality, happiness is a very ancient concept. It goes back to the ancient Greek philosophers. So Socrates, 2,500 years ago, said that there are 2 types of happiness. There's the happiness that you get from owning things, buying things, wealth, achievement, power. And he classed that as the lower level of happiness. He said it was fleeting, it was temporary. You'd get a taste of it, but then you'd want more of it. But he said there's a higher level of happiness, and that comes through altruism, doing the right thing. And then about 100 years later, Aristotle built on that. And Aristotle reasoned that every action of every human, every day, is predicated on their personal desire for happiness. So even when you're being mean to somebody, normally you're being mean because you think it's going to make you happy. And there was a senator at the time who said to Aristotle, this is complete rubbish. And so Aristotle said, are you going to run for election? We have a very great politician with us. And he said, yes, I am going to run for election. And he said, why are you going to run for election? He said, because I want to be in the Senate. He said, why do you want to be in the Senate? He said, because I want power. He said, why do you want power? And he reflected and said, because it will make me happy. And so what Speedon realised 100 years ago was if you think about the happiness of your people, they will work harder. They will be more committed. As a consequence of which, your customers will get better service. As a consequence of which, they will stay with you for longer. As a consequence of which, over the long term, you will have a more successful and a more profitable business. That was his very straightforward logic. Now, I first started going to business schools in the early, mid-1990s. And I can remember going to Columbia Business School in New York in 95. And in a lecture theatre much smaller than this, with 48 executives who'd flown in from around the world, a lecturer walked in to start the 2-week course and wrote on the chalkboard, what is the supreme purpose of a chief executive? And hands shot up and he pointed to people. And by and large, the answers were completely consistent. The supreme purpose of a chief executive is to maximize profit, to make profit at any cost, to make sure the business grows. And the lecturer was very pleased with this. He realized that certainly 47 of the 48 people in the room were on the right page. And I put my hand up and I said, well, I've worked in a company for the last almost 15 years, where the supreme purpose of the chief executive officer is to maximize the happiness of the people that work in the business. Well, I'm not proud to say I wrecked the course for a fortnight, because at every turn we talked about chicken and egg. Which comes first? The happiness of your people, the happiness of your customers, the profits that flow to shareholders. What's been fascinating for me to watch over the 25 years almost since I went to that first course was that academic institutions, business schools, now increasingly talk about balanced scorecards. They've moved away from this concept that it's all about the management team driving for profit at all costs, come what may. Some do talk now about you should start with employees. Some start with it's about the customer and being customer-centric. But if you think it's about the customer and being customer-centric, you can't have great customer service unless you've got an engaged and a happy workforce. Some talk about it being for all shareholders. But whatever way you now look at it, it's increasingly important to think about all the stakeholders that a business is looking after. And since that course, there has been more and more academic research into the benefits of an engaged and a happy workforce. One of the best that I could advise you to read if you're interested in the topic is a Harvard Business Review from the early 90s called Putting the Service Profit Chain to Work. And it analyses companies which have happy and engaged workforces. It measures then their effect on customer service. It measures customer service effect on profitability and shareholder returns. But if I take an amalgam now of the results that have been produced, companies with the most engaged and the happiest workforces have profits that are 20% higher, have productivity that's 20% higher, have wastage or shrink that's over 40% lower. They have lower staff turnover. And when you think the average cost of recruitment is between £1,000 and £5,000 in the UK, and they have lower sick absence. And the numbers on sick absence and lost days in the UK are typically about 7 days a year. So they have lower costs of recruitment and they have lower costs in terms of sick absence. And research last year said that earnings per share in companies that have high levels of engagement are 134% higher. Overwhelmingly now, the academic research says if you have a happy and engaged workforce, you will perform better commercially, and your individuals in your company will also feel much better. Now, when I talk like this, I do get people in the room that say, look, those figures are tosh, absolute tosh. We don't believe that if you've got a happy workforce who are really committed and engaged, you do get better results. To which my response is this. If you believe there is no difference whatsoever in the results that you get from a happy workforce or an unhappy and unengaged workforce, why would you want the latter? Why would you want to go into work every day and make the people that work for you unhappy and miserable? So for me, there's a social benefit that comes on top of the commercial benefit. In the middle of the screen is a picture of a book which I had published 2 years ago now called Fairness for All. And in that book, I set out the approach that was taken by Speed and Lewis, and I talk about the principle that underlines this, and I talk about these figures and more. And then I talk about how you go about achieving increased workplace happiness. But the reason that I wrote the book, the catalyst from the book, was that I went to the Occupy protest outside St. Paul's in 2011. And I don't know if you remember this, if you're from the UK, and if you're from outside the UK, as a reprise, what happened is that people went and pitched tents outside St. Paul's in the winter of 2011. And they stayed there for 5 months. And the reason they stayed there for 5 months was that they were camped on church ground. And because they were peaceful protesters, the church didn't feel that they could instruct the police to move them on. And the police said that they were powerless to move them on unless the church asked them to do so. And I went on 3 occasions to visit the protesters. And the first thing that struck me was that these were not Molotov cocktail throwing youths. These were, for want of a better word, ordinary people who had come to have their voice heard. And the things they were saying were these. We don't like austerity. We're working harder and our pay isn't going up, but costs are going up, so we feel less well paid. We can't get our kids into the schools that we want to get them into. We can't see the GP when we want to get to see the GP. And then on the work front, they were saying, we feel under pressure. We have to produce more, but we're not given more. We think that our wages are being suppressed by people coming to work here. We're seeing our jobs outsourced to places in the world that we don't even know. And I talked to one lady who I thought summed it up brilliantly, who worked in Burnley in a factory. And she said 5 years ago there were 300 jobs in our factory. There are now 50 jobs in our factory. Automation has come in, and we have been told that another 30 of us are going to go in the next year. Technology is great. Technology will create jobs. But for that individual, there was a real concern about the way that the market was working. There was real concerns about the pay gap between the haves and the have-nots, the lack of transparency. So when I heard all of that, I thought that these weren't dissimilar to the issues that Speed & Lewis was facing 100 years ago, at the end of the First World War, the rise of Marxism and communism. Therefore, what I want to talk about is what he did to create a happier society. Now, when I was Minister of State for Trade and Investment, which I took on 4 months before the referendum, and then I spent the next year and a quarter travelling the world trying to persuade countries to keep doing their trade deals with the UK, I visited 35 countries. And what struck me is that sentiment in the UK was replicated everywhere, apart from Vietnam and China. But everywhere else, people had the same concerns. Absolutely bizarrely, when I visited Austria, Germany, France, and Holland, I saw protests on the streets against the trade deal that the EU was going to do with Canada. And people were saying, our jobs are going to go, that somehow America is going to come in through the back door and it's going to take away our public services. They're all going to be made private, and we don't like that. And so there was this huge level of concern about the way the system was working. All of the things that Speed & Lewis looked to address 100 years ago. So what did he do? How did the John Lewis Partnership start to quantify what a happy and engaged workforce looks like? Well, there are 6 things. The first is reward and recognition. So by reward, I mean pay. On pay, what the research says is that if you are paid 5% less than you think you are worth, it will niggle away at you pretty well all the time. You'll think this business is having me on the cheap. But if you are paid 5% more than you think you're worth, you do not work harder. You do not skip into work every day and say, I'm getting a really good deal here. It's a hygiene factor. Pay is no more than a hygiene factor. In the research that I do, pay ranks number 9 in the reasons that people are either happy or unhappy at work. Far more important is recognition. On average, people are thanked for doing a good job once every 4.5 months. 3 times a year, if you're lucky, somebody will say to you, well done, that was really good. And yet what we know from all of our research is that's far more of a motivator to you. It will feed into your happiness far more than getting your pay slightly above or slightly below. The second thing is information. The information about how your organisation is doing so that you understand the full picture, and the information that you need to do your job well. Charles Dunson, who set up the Carphone warehouse and TalkTalk, once said to me that if he could do anything to copy the John Lewis Partnership, it would be to publish every week his sales figures, so that all of the people in his business knew exactly how the organisation was doing. But for many people, they feel that information is power. They don't want to share widely. But for Speed & Lewis, this was the single most important thing. He felt that every week you should share through the journals information about the organisation. When I ran Waitrose, the board minutes would be published and circulated so everybody knew what we'd discussed at the board. If somebody stops and asks you a question, then you answer that question. The third thing is about empowerment, genuinely empowering people to be able to do a job and then to recognise them for doing that well. One of the greatest advocates for the principle of workplace happiness is Richard Branson. He's always said, it's all about my employees. If I look after them, then this organisation will do well. And the best illustration that I can give you of that is this. It's not a story from the John Lewis Partnership. It's a story from the town that I live in called Sturminster Newton in North Dorset. And I moved there about 7 years ago. And about 5 years ago now, there was a delivery company in the UK called CityLink. I don't know if you've heard of CityLink, but they used to deliver parcels, internet deliveries, etc. And the reason that you might remember them is that they went spectacularly bust 10 days before Christmas. And so the news at night was millions of people have got their Christmas presents in these warehouses and they're now not going to get them for Christmas because the administrator won't let them out. And it just so happened that there was a chap that I'd got to know who lived in Sturminster Newton who worked for CityLink. And I saw him and I said, look, what are you going to do? He said, all I've ever been is a delivery driver. He said, so I'm going to set myself up as a delivery driver. So I wished him well, and I saw him about 3-4 months later, and I said, how's it going? He said, it's brilliant. It's utterly brilliant. I love it. So I said, well, tell me, why do you like it? He said, well, when I worked for CityLink, they gave me a van. And when the van had done 100,000 miles, they gave me a new van. He said, if I smashed the van or scraped the van, it just went into a body shop and I got another one. He said, if I'm honest, I trashed it. He said, now I've bought a van with my own money. He said, I know if I drive it carefully, I'll get 200,000 miles out of it. I wash that van every day because I want it to look great when I turn up outside a customer's house. I check the tyre and the water and the oil every week. I can't afford for this van to be off the road. It's going to cost me more money. He said, when I worked for CityLink, they gave me 2 polo shirts to wear for the entire year. He said, by Easter, they were disgusting. He said, now I wear a shirt and tie every day so that when I tip up, I look good. He said, when I worked for CityLink, I was tagged. I had GPS on the van, and I would get text saying, you're ahead of time, you're behind time, you need to catch up. And I had a set amount of time to get around my 60, 70 deliveries. He said all I was concerned around was getting those parcels out there. I'd ring the doorbell. If it wasn't answered in 10 seconds, I'd either throw the parcel over the wall, leave it on the doorstep. I couldn't afford to do anything else. He said, now, if somebody phones me at 9 o'clock at night, I'll take the phone call. If they want the delivery at 6 o'clock the next morning, I'll make that delivery at 6 o'clock the next morning. That, for me, is the difference between owning something and really caring about it and feeling as though you are working on somebody else's behalf. If there is a great secret to the John Lewis Partnership, and it's not perfect by any means, it's that the tens of thousands of people that work there feel that they own part of the organisation and its success. When you have an annual review of performance, there are 2 ways to conduct it. I can either give you a list of things that I want you to do, and I say, here's your list for 2019. We'll meet in 2020. I'll check the list off. I'll tell you whether you've done well or not, and then I'm going to give you another list for 2020. Or I can say to you, what do you feel that you achieved in 2019? How could I have helped you perform even better? What resources do you need to achieve more? For 2020, what are your targets? How can I help you achieve those targets? What more do you want to do? In the second of those, you own the results. You're accountable for the results. There needs to be a framework, there needs to be guidelines, but you start to own results. That's the difference between owning something and caring for it and feeling that you are working on somebody else's behalf. The fourth area is well-being. Long before the NHS, Speed and Lewis had put doctors into department stores, physiotherapists and chiropodists. In part, that was to look after his people. But also, it was because he knew it made good business sense to keep them on their feet, to keep them at work. But the message was that he cared. My favourite quote, my absolute favourite quote, is Theodore Roosevelt, ex-president of the United States, who said, "Nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care." And in my book, there's a number of stories from business leaders who have demonstrated on a very personal level that they care either for the financial, the mental, or the physical well-being of their workforce. The fifth is sense of pride, feeling that you're doing something worthwhile, having a sense of purpose. You'll all have heard the story about the cleaner at NASA who asked when his job was, said, "I'm putting a man on the moon." If you can create in people that sense that they're doing something more, they're doing something worthwhile, they're helping people have happier lives or whatever, they're driven more in the organisation they work for. And then lastly, job satisfaction. Now, job satisfaction is a catch-all for two things. First, it's about career development. Is this organisation genuinely concerned about my development as an individual, as well as the development of the team and the achievement of goals? The second, which is the most important, is the relationship that you either have or you do not have with your line manager. 83% of people leave organisations, great organisations, Googles, Facebooks, because they do not have a good relationship with their line manager. So if you take out maternity leave, paternity leave, caring, moving for promotion, the main reason that people go, 83%, is because of that breakdown in a relationship. So those are all the things that the John Lewis Partnership does and has codified to try and measure and understand if people feel happy and engaged. So when I stepped down from the government a year and a half ago, I decided that what I wanted to do was to try and help individuals and organisations understand if they were happy at work and to give them some really practical steps to do that. So one of the last chapters in my book is if you care about it, you'll measure it. And there are ways that any company can measure the happiness of their people, their staff turnover, their retention, their sick absence. But on top of that, I think there are a few questions that you can ask, 18, I think I set out 12 in the book, but 18 in total, that get to the heart of whether people feel that they are happy or not in these 6 areas. So having written the book, I decided what I'd do is to build a digital channel called Engaging Works that was free to any individual anywhere in the world to go and take the survey and to compare how happy they were against people that looked like them. So way more than 10,000 people have taken the survey now, and what it does is it compares you to people that look like you, your age, your gender, your industry, etc., and tells you whether you're happy or less happy and in which areas. So the survey takes only a few minutes to do. It's actually about 7 minutes. I put 5 up there. And you get results instantaneously. You don't have to wait a week or a month. 10 seconds after finishing the survey, you get the results. Now, the reason I say that is with Laurie, we agreed that we would share a link so that delegates here, if they wanted to, could go and take the happiness survey. And what I'm going to do in the next few minutes that are available to me is tell you a headline of how you did. At the moment, the global happiness score is 653 out of 1,000. Delegates here scored 649, so slightly under the global average. And then against the industry, I put in, because you're all from different places, I put in business services, and you're slightly behind the business service average. Against those 6 areas, you were amber across all of them. That's really unusual. Normally you find some score high and some score lowly. But what I wanted to do was give you a bit more of an insight. There are 7 matrices when you complete the survey. How empowered you feel, whether you have a sense of purpose, inclusivity, well-being. So there's a test to see what your well-being's like. And on all of those, you're compared to the outside world as an individual. But as a company, we cluster the results by demographics, so age, gender, etc. So what the chart on the left shows you is a matrix called apostles and anarchists. Apostles are people that are happy in their job and would happily recommend where they work to other people. Anarchists are people who are not happy in their job and also would not recommend where they work. And you can see there's a line there, and I'm not going to say who's in which box. What I can tell you, though, for those of you in healthcare, where you tend to score is in the top left-hand box, which is called martyrs. These are people who are not necessarily happy, but they would recommend where they work to friends and families. Why? Because they are very, very proud of the NHS and what they do. The people who are in the bottom right-hand box are individualists. These are people who are happy where they work, but they would not recommend it to friends and families. These are bankers and lawyers. These are people who get a lot of money and they're kind of happy staying where they are, but they really wouldn't want other people to do what they're doing. The box on the right is called the Stickiness Index. And this is the indicator of how likely you are to either stay in your current job and leave. And there are two major determinants, both of which I've mentioned. The first is whether you get on or not with your line manager, the relationship you have and whether it's bearable. If you do that, then you end up in the top right-hand column and you're an enthusiastic Remainer. If you don't have a good relationship with your line manager and you don't feel that you are paid fairly, you are a determined exiter. What research shows is that for as little as a 5% increase in pay, if you do not have a good relationship with your line manager, you'll leave. You can be easily tempted to go elsewhere. So given that we've done this survey all over the world, and we've got results from 106 companies and over 10,000 individuals, I just wanted to share a few thoughts that you might find thought-provoking. The UK is the 10th happiest place in the world for workplace happiness. If you include the 3 Scandinavian countries, we actually come 13th. What's fascinating is that almost directly correlates to the UK's ranking for productivity. America's much happier. Austria normally comes out at the top of the list. Things that we should feel less proud about, 37% of people say that they are anxious when they go to work in the morning, anxious or depressed. 70% of millennials are actively seeking a new job. Women are happier than men. Only just, but women in the workplace over the last year were happier than men. Non-managers are less happy than managers, as you might expect. But with one real curiosity, for millennials, those aged under the age of 35, non-managers are happier than managers. And that's the first time we've seen that. And I think that speaks to management being stripped out, a lack of coaching and support, a feeling that they're being left to sink or swim. But there's a real difference between millennium managers and older managers in the workplace. In terms of this room, healthcare, 602 out of 1,000, retail, 635, hospitality, much higher. What's peculiar is that retail scores normally in the bottom 5 of categories. There are 26 categories of businesses. Normally, hospitality scores in the top 5. You'd expect them to be the same, but there is a big difference in terms of the scores for hospitality. So, got a whole host of results that I've been developing, or we've been developing over the course of the last year and a half. If you're interested in any of that data, it's free of charge to you. If you come to me and say, I'd like to know results for healthcare or for men or for women, then I'm really happy to send you a pack and to give you that data insight. I've gone over by 46 seconds or so, so my apologies for doing that. I can't take any questions now, but if you had some, I'm happy to answer them as part of the panel. Thank you all very much.